legends. This is episode 2 covering the legendary Radeon R9 290 graphics card, which I consider to be one of the best value for money GPUs that has ever been released. If you haven't watched episode 1 where we covered the AMD FX 9590, the first 5 GHz desktop CPU, then check that out. But for now, let's get into this legendary GPU. What made the R9 290 such a legend, and was it really that much of an improvement over the previous generation? Well, let's take a look at what AMD was offering previously. The Radeon HD 7000 series launched at the start of 2012, coming in with 3 28nm GPUs named Tahiti, Pitcairn, and Cape Verde, with each one roughly doubling the amount of shader units compared to the previous one. Now, I won't go over every model, but some of the key ones were the HD 7770, which was a very popular entry-level GPU, the HD 7850 and 7870, which were looked at as great value for money GPUs at the time, the 7950, which was also considered a very good value GPU, and the legendary HD 7970. The 7970 was an amazing GPU. I bought one along with many other people. It featured 2048 shader units, 32 compute units, and 3 GB of GDDR5 memory on a 384-bit bus, which was considered a great amount at the time. Clock speeds were initially 925 MHz for the reference models, but soon many GHz edition models started to come out with clock speeds of 1000 MHz or 1 GHz or higher, and these were the main ones that people bought. The TDP was high for the time at 250 watts, but this was overlooked because of the card's great performance. Those that couldn't wait and jumped in early and bought a reference model of 7970 were immediately confronted with high temperatures and very high fan noise levels, which shocked many tech YouTubers at the time.
And also take this into account, it's freaking loud. We're talking like ridiculously loud. At idle, the thing runs hot. It was like getting around 60 degrees on idle sometimes. I had to take the side panel of the case off. I need to put some more fans in there, but still getting close to, idle is 56 degrees Celsius. That's crazy.
Fortunately, non-reference models were offered very quickly, and the majority of consumers bought those, including myself, although many of these were still relatively loud, but a huge improvement over the reference models, that's for sure. Again, this was generally overlooked because of the performance. So if we see, that's the size comparison. So that's a Sapphire 7970 Vapor X, and then that's the Power Color R9 290 PCIe Plus. A few months later, NVIDIA launched its GeForce 600 series. These 28nm Kepler GPUs were aimed at achieving an increase in performance compared to the previous generation, but also increasing performance per watt, achieving this through the use of a unified clock. They also made huge gains in memory clock speeds, increasing the speed of the GDDR5 memory to 6000 MHz compared to the previous generation's 4000 MHz. For reference, the 7970 had a default memory speed of 5500 MHz, and these improvements were primarily made through new memory controller designs. The 600 series had many GPUs on offer. Popular ones were the GTX 660, the very popular GTX 670, which I also owned, and the 7970 competitor, the GTX 680. The 600 series were also the first NVIDIA GPUs to feature GPU boost, which is similar to CPU turbo clock speeds. The GPU has a minimum or base clock speed, but has the ability to boost up to higher clock speeds if the loads are lower. This is done without exceeding the GPU's TDP. Speaking of TDP, the 195 watt TDP of the 680 was quite a bit less than the 250 watt TDP of the 7970, but it also had less memory at 2 GB versus 3 GB for the 7970, although this memory was slightly faster as we mentioned earlier. Performance-wise and price-wise, the GTX 680 and the 7970 were very equally matched, which made the GPU market very competitive at the time, as consumers had to decide between the 680's lower TDP or the 7970's higher memory amount. With AMD and NVIDIA locked in a close battle with their current top-end cards, everybody was excited to see what would be coming out next. Surprisingly, it was Nvidia to launch the first next generation card when they launched the first GTX Titan with its GK110 Kepler GPU in February of 2013. Now this card wasn't aimed at the general consumers out there because it came with a price of 1,000 US dollars, which is far beyond what most people can afford, so I consider the real 700 series launch in May of 2013. The 700 series stayed with the 28nm Kepler GPU, although many improvements to improve energy efficiency, especially in regards to caching, led them to make much larger GPUs than the previous generation, with the GTX 780 and its GK110 Kepler GPU having 40% more CUDA cores than the GTX 680 and its GK104 Kepler GPU. This resulted in a 20% performance increase over the 680, with the GTX 770 being essentially a rebranded GTX 680 with 7000 MHz GDDR5 memory versus the 6000 MHz of the 680, so this meant it was only a little bit faster. The 780 also matched the 7970 with 3GB of GDDR5 memory on a 384-bit bus with slightly higher memory speeds, and it also matched it with a 250-watt TDP, although the reference NVIDIA cooler was actually decent and appealed to many people with its more industrial design. The GTX 780 had pulled a solid 20% performance gap over the 7970, although it did come with a $650 US price tag at launch, which was quite the premium to pay. I am also aware I haven't mentioned the dual GPU 7990. This is for a variety of reasons, and I'll make a dedicated video about it in an upcoming Hardware Legends episode. So everyone was looking towards what AMD would launch, and in October of 2013 they finally launched the new Radeon 200 series with the R5, R7 and R9 models. For this video though, we'll only be looking at the R9 models, which were by far the most popular. The new 28nm Hawaii GPUs in the R9 290 and 290X were very powerful, being very similar aside from the 290 having 2,560 shader units compared to the 290X's 2,816, and having 160 TMUs compared to the 290X's 176. It also had a slightly lower clock speed of 950 MHz compared to the 1000 MHz of the 290X. However, they shared the exact same 4GB of GDDR5 memory on a whopping 512-bit bus at 5000 MHz, which gave the 290 and 290X's 10% higher memory bandwidth than the GTX 780. The 290 came with a staggering 275-watt TDP, with the 290X coming in with a 300-watt TDP, which was crazy enough, but then AMD released them with basically the same hairdryer, airplane engine, vacuum cleaner reference cooler that was infamous from the previous generation. But I hear you say, you could just buy a non-reference model, right? Well, unfortunately, it would be a few months before non-reference models would become available, which meant that consumers either had to wait, or they would just have to bite the bullet and deal with a reference 290 or 290X. It should also be mentioned that the R9 280X, which was just a rebadged 7970 GHz edition, was available in non-reference models straight from launch. These were also considered very good value for money at the time for those that couldn't quite afford an R9 290, although I do consider the 290 being the better overall GPU in terms of value for money. Performance-wise, the R9 290 would on average match or slightly beat the GTX 780, which was a huge win for AMD at the time, as the R9 290 launched with a price tag of $400 US. Although to be fair, Nvidia did cut the 780 pricing down to around $500 US in order to compensate for this. The 290X came in at $550 US, but only offered between 5 to 8% extra performance over the 290, which made it much less appealing in terms of value for money, causing the 290 to surge in popularity as one of the best value for money graphics cards ever. The 290 and 290X did have their drawbacks though compared to the GTX 780. The reference models were incredibly hot, running consistently at 95 degrees Celsius while gaming, which actually resulted in me not needing to use my heater in winter in order to keep myself warm. I'm not kidding. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the power usage was really high on the 290s and 290Xs, but to be fair, the GTX 780 also chugged quite a bit. However, the reference 780 was much quieter than the horrendously loud reference 290s and 290Xs, which resulted in many people trying to modify the reference cooler in order to improve airflow to lower temperatures and lower noise. Soon though, the non-reference coolers arrived, and consumers could rejoice that they finally had decent coolers to prevent their 290s from thermal throttling and bring down those really high fan noise speeds. It also allowed people to start overclocking them, which resulted in even better performance. Nvidia didn't just sit around though, and quickly responded with the GTX 780 Ti about a month after the 290 and 290X launch. The 780 Ti was essentially a GTX Titan with half the memory, giving it the same memory as the 780 but higher memory speeds to give it a slightly higher memory bandwidth than the 290 and 290Xs. It also came with 2,880 CUDA cores, which was more than what the Titan had, and all of this resulted in 10% higher performance than the 290X and around 15% higher performance than the 290, although this did come at a huge price premium as it had a launch price of $700 US, which meant that only the enthusiasts such as myself actually bought one. The 290 was the main graphics card that people bought at the time though. Its value for money was just phenomenal, and most tech reviewers were extremely happy with the performance per dollar that the 290 provided, although most agreed that it would be best to avoid the reference model. That is unless you want a 95 degrees Celsius hairdryer running in your PC, which is what I had. My reference R9 290 was actually an ex-Bitcoin mining card too. And it was the GPU I owned for the longest time, and it never missed a beat. It was just a fantastic graphics card. This episode of Hardware Legends is sponsored by ekoffers.com. So this is a great website if you want to pick up a Windows license, or maybe you're looking to grab Microsoft Office, and you can use my 20% off coupon code, which I'll put in the description down below, to save yourself even more money. Now let's get back to the video. Especially those who have been long-time subscribers of Tech Showdown, will know that the R9 290 has a special place in my heart. It was the GPU that launched this channel, and it was the GPU that I tested the most extensively, reviewing so many different models and trying to inform as many people as I could about which models were good and which models were bad. I never intended to start a tech channel. I just saw that there was almost no comparisons showing the difference between non-reference R9 290 models. Lots of people didn't know which ones were good and which ones were bad, so I decided to use all my savings in order to buy and sell as many R9 290s as I could. This was to inform as many people as possible about which ones to buy and which ones to avoid. I just felt like people needed to know, and if nobody else was going to do it, then it may as well be me. I enjoyed testing those cards so much, and I cherished every subscriber I ever got. This is something I still do now. The R9 290 was an awesome graphics card, and my wish is that AMD will release a great value GPU just like it again in the future. I thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please share it around, and as always, I'll see you guys next time.